Finally, it's happening at last. My oldest son didn't shout those words. He didn't laugh or celebrate. He whispered them beneath his breath, believing I would never hear, but I did. And in that single, unguarded moment, 44 years of fatherhood collapsed right in front of me. Only seconds earlier, I had told him I had lost almost everything. The company I had spent my entire life building was gone. My retirement savings had supposedly vanished. I told him I would probably have to sell the family home before the end of the year because I could no longer afford to keep it. I expected disbelief. I expected concern, maybe even a hug. Instead, my son smiled. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet smile of a man whose greatest obstacle had finally begun to disappear. Finally. That one word changed everything I believed about my own family. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. My name is Richard Calloway. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life I believed that success was measured by what you left behind for your children. I spent more than 4 decades building a medical cold chain logistics company, from a single refrigerated truck into one of the largest regional distributors in the Pacific Northwest. I survived recessions, supply chain crises, impossible deadlines, and the hardest day of my life, the morning I buried my wife, Margaret, after 41 years of marriage. Through every setback, I told myself the sacrifices were worth it, because one day my sons would inherit not only financial security, but the values their mother and I had worked so hard to teach them. At least, that was what I believed until one quiet Sunday evening changed everything. Ethan arrived precisely on time, carrying an expensive bottle of wine we both knew would never be opened. He hugged me warmly, complimented the dinner, asked whether I had been taking my blood pressure medication, and even insisted on washing the dishes after we finished eating. If anyone had walked through the front door during those first 30 minutes, they would have described him as the perfect son. Looking back now, I realize perfection can be the most convincing disguise of all. After dinner, I carried 2 cups of coffee into the dining room and sat across from him at the same oak table where Margaret had once gathered our family every Sunday without fail. I stared for a moment at her empty chair before quietly saying the words I had rehearsed for weeks. I told Ethan that selling my company hadn't gone as planned. I said most of my retirement investments had collapsed, and unless something changed quickly, I would have no choice but to sell the house his mother and I had built together almost 30 years earlier. For less than a heartbeat, every expression disappeared from his face. Then the corners of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. Finally, he whispered before he realized the word had escaped. The smile vanished almost instantly. "Dad, that's not what I meant." He laughed nervously and tried to explain himself, saying he only meant I had finally trusted someone enough to admit I needed help. He offered to recommend a real estate agent. He promised everything would work out. He told me I wasn't facing this alone. Every sentence sounded thoughtful. Every sentence sounded sincere. Every sentence arrived one sentence too late. Because the first reaction people have is almost always the honest one. I smiled back, thanked him for caring, and watched him leave my house believing he had successfully hidden what I had just seen. The moment his car disappeared down the street, I locked the front door, walked back into the dining room, and looked around the home Margaret and I had spent a lifetime creating. Then I quietly admitted something that still makes me ashamed. Everything I had told my oldest son that evening was a lie. I hadn't lost a single dollar. I wasn't selling the house. Every investment account was exactly where it had always been. The entire conversation had been nothing more than a test. And my son had failed it with a single word. What I didn't know was that before the next sunrise, I would accidentally overhear a phone call that would prove, finally, wasn't a mistake. It was the beginning of a plan my own son had been preparing for much longer than I ever imagined. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the same word again. Finally, I tried to convince myself I had misunderstood Ethan. Maybe he had simply chosen the wrong word. Maybe the stress of believing his father was losing everything had made him say something foolish before he had time to think. Fathers become experts at explaining away their children's mistakes. We tell ourselves, there must be another reason, because accepting the truth hurts too much. By sunrise, I had almost talked myself into believing I had overreacted. Then I started remembering things I had ignored for more than a year. Not one dramatic event. Not one obvious betrayal. Just dozens of small conversations that had never felt important until I placed them beside each other. It started shortly after I sold my company. Ethan had congratulated me, then casually asked whether the buyer had paid everything in one lump sum or through installments. At the time, I thought he was simply curious. A few weeks later, he wanted to know whether I had invested the proceeds myself or hired a financial advisor. Then he wondered whether the house was completely paid off. A month after that, he asked whether I had updated my will since Margaret passed away. Another Sunday, he mentioned that maintaining a large home alone probably wasn't practical anymore and suggested I should consider downsizing while the real estate market was still strong. Every question sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I had refused to see. The conversations never centered on how I was coping after losing my wife. He rarely asked whether I was lonely, whether I had been sleeping well, or whether I needed company. Instead, every discussion quietly drifted back toward money, property, investments, insurance policies, retirement accounts, or estate planning. Looking back, I realized Ethan knew the approximate value of my warehouse property, but couldn't remember the date of my annual medical checkup. He knew the housing market in my neighborhood almost to the dollar, yet forgot my birthday twice in 3 years. The imbalance was impossible to ignore once I stopped making excuses for it. Then, another memory surfaced. Last Christmas, Ethan had spent nearly 20 minutes asking whether I had ever considered transferring my assets into a family trust while I was still healthy enough to make future planning easier. I remembered laughing and telling him there would be plenty of time for that conversation later. He had smiled politely, but I now recognized something hidden behind that smile. Disappointment. At the time, I thought I was imagining it. Now I wasn't so sure. The more I remembered, the more uncomfortable I became. There had been questions about life insurance beneficiaries. Questions about whether I still managed my own online banking. Questions about who handled my taxes after Margaret died. Questions about whether I had granted anyone financial power of attorney. None of them sounded suspicious because they were never asked together. Ethan had spread them across dozens of phone calls and family dinners over many months. It was brilliant in its simplicity. No single conversation would ever raise alarm, but when I finally connected them, I realized my son hadn't been making conversation. He had been collecting information. I walked into my study and opened the drawer where Margaret used to keep important family papers. Sitting on top was an old photograph of the four of us standing in front of the company warehouse on the day Ethan started his first summer job. He couldn't have been more than 16. Back then, he had looked at me with admiration, proud to tell everyone he wanted to build something of his own one day. I stared at that photograph for several minutes, wondering when ambition had quietly become entitlement. When had my success stopped inspiring him and started looking like something waiting to be inherited? I still wasn't ready to believe my son was capable of betraying me. But for the first time, I was forced to admit something far more frightening. If Ethan truly had been preparing for this moment all along, then the word finally hadn't been an accident. It had been the honest reaction of a man who believed the future he had been planning was finally beginning to unfold. I had no idea that in less than an hour, I would hear a phone call that would erase every remaining doubt forever. The following morning began exactly like every Monday since I retired. I woke before sunrise, brewed a pot of coffee, opened the kitchen window, and stood quietly, watching the maple tree Margaret had planted nearly 30 years earlier. The house was silent, except for the ticking clock above the stove. I was still replaying Ethan's smile from the night before, trying one last time to convince myself I had misunderstood him. Then I heard the sound of a familiar engine outside. I glanced through the window and immediately recognized Ethan's SUV. At first, I assumed he had forgotten something after dinner and returned to drop it off. But instead of pulling into my driveway, he stopped across the street beneath a row of oak trees. He left the engine running but made no attempt to come to the house. That alone felt strange. I stayed where I was, hidden behind the curtains, expecting him to step out at any moment. He never did. A few seconds later, his phone connected to the vehicle's speaker system. I couldn't hear the person on the other end clearly, but I recognized the name Ethan spoke almost immediately. "Morning, Lucas." Lucas Grant. The commercial real estate developer Ethan had introduced me to at a charity dinner the previous year. They exchanged a few casual greetings before Ethan lowered his voice. Then I heard the sentence that changed everything. "He bought it." My fingers tightened around the coffee mug. "He thinks he's almost broke." I stopped breathing. Ethan listened for several seconds before laughing softly. "No, he won't wait very long. Once he believes he has no other option, he'll sell." My heart should have been racing, but years of negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts had taught me something valuable. Panic makes people stop listening. Calm allows them to hear everything. So I forced myself to stay perfectly still. Ethan continued speaking as though he were discussing an ordinary business deal. "The property is worth at least $1.8 million in this market. If we move quickly, we can probably lock it down for around 1.3 before anyone else gets involved." Another pause. Then he smiled. I could see it even from across the street. "Exactly. Once it's ours, the redevelopment project doubles the value." The coffee in my hand had gone completely cold. They weren't talking about helping an aging father through financial hardship. They were discussing an acquisition. My home wasn't a family memory anymore. It was an investment opportunity. Then the conversation became even worse. "Ben won't be a problem," Ethan said confidently. "He still believes whatever I tell him. I'll convince him selling is the only responsible option. If he thinks it's for Dad's own good, he'll stay out of it." Hearing my younger son's name hurt more than anything else. Ethan wasn't only planning to deceive me. He had already decided how to manipulate his own brother. Lucas spoke again, and Ethan laughed before replying. "No, don't contact Dad directly. Older people don't like feeling pressured. They have to believe the decision is theirs. I'll handle every conversation." I closed my eyes for a second, letting every word settle into my memory. This wasn't an impulsive idea born after our dinner the night before. They had discussed strategy, timing, pricing, psychology. They had studied me the same way investors studied a property before making an offer. Then Ethan said something I will never forget for as long as I live. "Once the house is sold, everything else becomes much easier." Everything else. Those two words echoed louder than anything that came before them. They weren't talking only about my home anymore. They were talking about my retirement accounts, my investment portfolio, the proceeds from selling my company, the warehouse property Margaret and I had purchased decades earlier, and every other asset I still owned. Suddenly, every question Ethan had asked over the past year made perfect sense. He hadn't been making conversation. He had been building a financial map of my entire life. A few seconds later, the call ended. Ethan drove away without ever realizing his father had heard every word. I remained standing at the kitchen window long after his SUV disappeared around the corner. Less than 24 hours earlier, I had believed one careless smile had revealed my son's true feelings. Now I understood the truth was infinitely worse. Finally, hadn't been an accident. It had been the reaction of a man who believed the first step of a plan he had spent months preparing had finally begun. I walked slowly into my study, opened the drawer where Margaret had always kept our legal papers, and took out the business card of the one person I trusted more than anyone outside my family. Printed beneath her name were 3 words that suddenly felt less like legal advice and more like a warning. Evelyn Foster, estate attorney. I picked up the phone, but before calling her, I knew there was one person who deserved to hear the truth first, my younger son, Ben. I didn't call my attorney first. I called my younger son. Ben answered before the second ring finished. "Dad, everything okay?" His voice carried genuine concern, the kind that couldn't be rehearsed. I looked out the study window for a moment before answering. "Can you come over today? There's something I need to tell you, and I don't want to do it over the phone." He didn't ask a single question. "I'll be there in a few hours." That was Ben. If someone he loved needed him, explanations could wait. Just after lunch, his old pickup truck rolled into the driveway. He walked through the front door, carrying a paper bag from the diner we used to visit after fishing trips. "I figured you probably forgot to eat," he said with a small smile. That simple gesture hurt more than I expected, because it reminded me what genuine concern actually looked like. We sat at the dining table where Ethan had been sitting less than 24 hours earlier. I didn't ease into the conversation. I told Ben everything. I admitted that I had lied about losing my retirement savings. I explained that the entire story had been a test. Then I repeated Ethan's reaction exactly as it had happened, including the single word that refused to leave my mind. Finally, Ben stared at the table without speaking. His expression wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Then I described the phone call I had overheard that morning. Every sentence, every detail. Lucas Grant. The plan to convince me I had no choice but to sell. The discussion about buying the house hundreds of thousands of dollars below market value. The redevelopment project. And finally, the part about manipulating Ben into supporting the sale without ever questioning Ethan's motives. The room fell completely silent. After nearly a minute, Ben finally looked at me. "Dad, are you absolutely certain it was Ethan?" I nodded once. "I wish I weren't." He leaned back slowly, rubbing both hands across his face as though trying to wake himself from a nightmare. Then he whispered something I never expected to hear. "Now it makes sense." I frowned. "What makes sense?" Ben hesitated before answering. "About 6 months ago, Ethan started telling me you were having financial problems." My stomach tightened immediately. Ben continued. "He said selling the company hadn't worked out the way everyone thought. He told me your investments had gone badly after Mom passed away. He even asked me not to mention it because you were embarrassed." Suddenly, dozens of strange moments from the past year fell into place. Ben had insisted on paying every restaurant bill whenever we met. He had quietly replaced my old lawnmower after it broke down. Last Christmas, I had found an envelope containing several $1,000s hidden inside my desk drawer, with a note claiming it was repayment for an old loan that had never existed. I had laughed and returned the money, assuming Ben was simply being overly generous. Now I understood the truth. He genuinely believed his father was struggling to survive. Ethan hadn't only lied to me. He had spent months creating two completely different realities. One where I believed my family trusted me, and another where Ben believed I was quietly falling apart. "I'm sorry," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have asked you directly instead of believing him." I shook my head immediately. "No, Ethan counted on the fact that you'd trust your older brother. That isn't your failure. It's his." Ben remained silent for a long moment before asking the question I had been asking myself since sunrise. "What are you going to do now?" I looked toward Margaret's empty chair before answering. "Nothing." Ben frowned in confusion. "Nothing?" I nodded. "If Ethan realizes I know the truth, he'll change his plan. He'll hide everything. But if he believes I still trust him, he'll keep showing us exactly what he's trying to do." Ben sat quietly as the idea settled in. Finally, he gave a slow, determined nod. "So we let him think he's winning." "Exactly," I replied. "We don't accuse him. We don't argue. We don't warn him. We listen. We watch. And we let him walk into his own trap." For the first time that afternoon, I saw determination replace the shock in Ben's eyes. He leaned forward across the table. "Then you're not doing this alone anymore, Dad." After he left, I remained in the dining room for several minutes, staring at Margaret's photograph hanging above the fireplace. I had one son who had spent months planning how to take advantage of me, and another who had quietly tried to save me from a hardship that never existed. The difference between them wasn't intelligence or success. It was character. I walked into my study, picked up Evelyn Foster's business card once again, and this time I dialed her number. Before the day was over, I would discover that Ethan's plan was even more dangerous than either Ben or I had imagined. Evelyn Foster had been my attorney for nearly 25 years. She had drafted every major legal document Margaret and I had ever signed, from the sale of company shares to our estate plan, property deeds, and retirement trust. She wasn't easily surprised, which was why the expression on her face after listening to my story unsettled me more than Ethan's phone call ever had. I finished describing everything without leaving out a single detail. The dinner, the fake story about losing my retirement savings, Ethan's instinctive "finally," and every word I had overheard the following morning. Evelyn never interrupted. She simply filled page after page of a yellow legal pad before quietly placing her pen on the desk. Then she looked directly into my eyes and said something I wasn't prepared to hear. "Richard, your house isn't the real target." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Without answering immediately, she drew a small circle in the center of the page and wrote one word inside it. House. Around that circle she added several more. Retirement accounts, investment portfolio, warehouse property, estate, trust. Finally, she connected every word with arrows until they formed a web. If someone is willing to manipulate an elderly parent into selling valuable property far below market value, she said calmly, that person is almost never interested in stopping there. The house is simply the easiest door to open. Her words sent a chill through me because they explained something I hadn't fully understood. Ethan hadn't spent a year asking questions about my finances because he wanted one asset. He wanted a complete map of everything Margaret and I had spent our lives building. Evelyn closed the notebook and folded her hands together. "This isn't a case about recovering stolen property," she continued. "Nothing has been stolen yet. This is a prevention case. And prevention is always easier than recovery." Those words immediately shifted my thinking. Until that moment, I had been focused on exposing Ethan. Evelyn wasn't interested in exposing him. She wanted to make his entire strategy impossible before he even realized the battlefield had changed. She asked me for every financial document I possessed: property deeds, investment statements, insurance policies, retirement accounts, company sale records, existing trust documents, my will. Even old powers of attorney Margaret and I had signed years earlier. By early afternoon, her conference table had disappeared beneath stacks of folders. She reviewed every page with remarkable patience, stopping only to ask questions that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with access. "Who besides you has seen these statements? Has Ethan ever handled any of your paperwork? Does anyone outside your immediate family know how your estate is structured?" I realized she wasn't investigating numbers. She was identifying every possible point where influence could become control. Several hours later, Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "Here's what we're going to do." She spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had already won cases much more complicated than mine. "First, we'll order independent valuations for every major asset. No one will ever pressure you into accepting an artificial price again. Second, we'll completely redesign your estate plan. Every assumption Ethan believes he understands will become outdated. Third, we'll transfer key assets into a professionally administered trust, so no emotional conversation can ever force a rushed financial decision. And finally," she paused before sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk. 3 words were typed across the top in bold letters: "Do nothing differently." I looked at her, confused. She smiled slightly. "Right now, Ethan believes you're vulnerable. That's his greatest strength." Then her expression hardened. "We're going to turn it into his greatest weakness." She explained that people running long-term manipulation almost always fail for the same reason. Success makes them impatient. The more convinced they become that victory is close, the more mistakes they make. "If Ethan notices even the smallest change in your behavior," she warned, "he'll become cautious, he'll slow down, he'll hide evidence. But if he believes you still trust him, he'll continue revealing exactly how far he's willing to go." As I stood to leave, Evelyn handed me a new folder, labeled only with my last name. It looked ordinary, but I understood what it represented. This was no longer a father's desperate attempt to understand his son. It had become a carefully planned legal operation, designed to protect everything Margaret and I had built before greed could destroy it. Driving home, I realized something had changed inside me. I was no longer asking whether Ethan would betray me. That question had already been answered. The only question that remained was whether he would recognize the trap before he walked into it. 2 days later, he called, sounding more confident than ever. "Dad," he said cheerfully, "I'd like to stop by this weekend. I think I finally found someone who can help solve your problem with the house." I already knew exactly who that someone would be, and for the first time since all of this began, I found myself looking forward to the meeting. For the next 2 weeks, I followed every instruction Evelyn had given me. I changed nothing. I answered Ethan's calls with the same calm voice I had always used. I invited him over for coffee when he suggested it. I even complained about rising utility bills and joked that retirement wasn't quite as relaxing as I had imagined. If he was watching for signs that I suspected anything, he found none. Every conversation convinced him a little more that I was exactly where he wanted me, an aging father slowly accepting that selling his home was the only practical solution. Meanwhile, Evelyn was quietly rebuilding every layer of protection around my life. Independent appraisers were evaluating my properties. New trust documents were being drafted. My accountant, Samuel Reed, reviewed every financial record from the sale of my company to ensure there wasn't a single vulnerability Ethan could exploit. Without making a scene or accusing anyone, we were closing every door Ethan believed he would eventually walk through. His confidence, however, continued to grow. He began calling almost every other day, always sounding concerned, always asking whether I had thought any more about selling the house. One afternoon he said, "Dad, I know this isn't easy, but waiting too long could cost you a lot of money." I thanked him for worrying about me and promised I was considering every option. He sounded relieved. He truly believed I was moving exactly where he wanted me to go. 3 days later, he called again. "I'd like you to meet someone," he said. "He's one of the most respected developers in the county. No pressure, just a conversation." I smiled to myself before answering. That sounds reasonable. Saturday afternoon arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine. At exactly 1 o'clock, Ethan's SUV pulled into my driveway. Lucas Grant stepped out of the passenger seat wearing an expensive navy suit and the confident smile of a man who had already decided the deal belonged to him. He shook my hand firmly and complimented the neighborhood before casually mentioning how quickly property values had been changing. It sounded like friendly conversation, but every sentence carried the rhythm of a sales pitch. I welcomed them inside, as though they were honored guests. Lucas admired the hardwood floors, the fireplace Margaret had designed herself, and the large backyard overlooking the maple tree. Ethan barely looked at any of it. His attention stayed fixed on the dimensions of the rooms, the condition of the roof, the detached garage, and the vacant land behind the house. I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Neither of them looked at the family photographs covering the hallway walls. They weren't walking through my home. They were inspecting an asset. After nearly half an hour, Lucas unfolded a digital tablet and displayed several redevelopment plans. Colorful architectural drawings replaced decades of family memories with luxury townhouses, underground parking, and retail space. "This neighborhood is entering a completely new phase," he explained smoothly. "If you decide to sell before winter, you'll avoid expensive maintenance while still receiving a very competitive offer." I asked the question I already knew the answer to. What kind of offer? Lucas named a figure almost identical to the number I had heard Ethan discuss over the phone that Monday morning. More than $500,000 below the independent valuation Evelyn had already received. I forced myself not to react. Instead, I slowly nodded and pretended to think about it. Ethan leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Dad, nobody's trying to pressure you. We just don't want you carrying responsibilities that are becoming harder every year." His words were carefully chosen. They weren't directed at my finances anymore. They were directed at my age. He wanted me to believe that growing older automatically meant surrendering control. I smiled weakly and thanked them both for their concern. "You've given me a lot to think about," I said. Those simple words seemed to satisfy them completely. As they drove away, I watched Ethan laughing with Lucas inside the SUV. He looked lighter than he had in months, almost victorious. He honestly believed the hardest part was over. Less than an hour later, I was sitting across from Evelyn as she compared Lucas's written proposal with the certified appraisal completed 2 days earlier. She placed both documents side by side without saying a word. The difference between them exceeded $500,000. Finally, she looked up and smiled for the first time since this ordeal had begun. "He's becoming impatient," she said quietly. "That's exactly what we needed." Over the following week, every safeguard we had planned was completed. Ownership of the house was transferred into the new trust. Additional protections were added to my investment accounts, requiring independent authorization before any major transaction could ever take place. Updated estate documents replaced every version Ethan believed still existed. By the time he called again, asking whether I had reached a final decision, there was nothing left he could legally manipulate. He simply didn't know it yet. "Dad," he said confidently over the phone, "I think it's time we sat down and finished this." I looked at Margaret's photograph resting on the bookshelf beside me and quietly agreed to meet him the following Friday. This time, however, the conversation wouldn't end with my signature on a contract. It would end with Ethan discovering that the man he believed was cornered had been patiently building a trap around him all along. Friday arrived with the kind of calm weather that makes ordinary days feel safe. The sun filtered through the maple tree Margaret had planted decades earlier, casting familiar shadows across the front porch. Looking at that tree, no one would have guessed an entire family was about to change forever. Ethan arrived exactly on time, carrying a dark leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. He wore the same tailored suit he reserved for important negotiations, and the confidence on his face reminded me of the countless times I had watched him close commercial real estate deals. Only this time, the property sitting across the negotiating table was his father's home. He stepped inside with an easy smile and hugged me as though nothing unusual had happened over the previous 2 weeks. "Good to see you, Dad," he said warmly. "I think today's going to take a lot of weight off your shoulders." I smiled politely and led him into the dining room. 2 cups of coffee were already waiting on the oak table where Margaret had spent so many Sunday afternoons bringing our family together. Ethan immediately opened his portfolio and carefully arranged several neatly organized documents in front of me. Market reports, comparable sales, financial projections, purchase agreements prepared by Lucas Grant's company. Everything had been assembled with professional precision. "I've tried to make this as simple as possible," he said. "If we move quickly, you'll avoid future expenses, and you'll still receive a fair price before the market changes." I didn't look at a single page. Instead, I slowly stirred my coffee and asked a question that caught him completely off guard. "Do you remember what you said to me the night I told you I had lost everything?" Ethan blinked. "About the house?" "No," I replied quietly. "The very first word you said." He hesitated for only a second before forcing a smile. "Dad, we already talked about that." I explained what I meant. I nodded. "Yes, you explained it." I let the silence stretch between us. But explanations are usually prepared after the truth escapes. His fingers stopped moving across the documents. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier began to fade. "Can we focus on the paperwork?" he asked. "We are," I answered. "Because that wasn't the only thing you said last week." His expression froze. I leaned back in my chair and spoke in the same calm tone Evelyn had told me to maintain. "Monday morning, 7:14. You parked across the street instead of driving home." Every trace of color disappeared from his face. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You answered a phone call from Lucas Grant," I continued. "You told him I believed my retirement savings were gone. You said I wouldn't wait long before selling because people my age panic when they think they have no options." Ethan's breathing became noticeably heavier. I never raised my voice. I didn't need to. Every sentence struck harder than anger ever could. "Then you discussed the value of this house," I continued. "You estimated it was worth at least $1.8 million, but said the two of you could probably convince me to accept around 1.3. His hands began trembling. The leather portfolio slowly slipped from his lap and landed on the floor with a dull thud. Neither of us moved to pick it up. "You also told Lucas not to contact me directly," I said. "You said older people don't like feeling pressured. They need to believe the decision is their own." Ethan stared at me as though he were looking at a stranger. Finally, barely able to breathe, he whispered, You heard that?" Every word. The room became perfectly silent. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan buried his face in his hands. "Dad, it isn't what it sounded like." I almost smiled at the irony. "Interesting," I replied softly. He looked up, confused. "Why?" "Because that's almost exactly what you said after you smiled and whispered finally." He closed his eyes. There were no rehearsed explanations left, no polished sales pitch, no carefully chosen language, only silence. Eventually, he whispered, "Please, just let me explain." "Go ahead," I said. He tried. He blamed Lucas. He claimed the developer had convinced him the property would eventually be sold anyway. He insisted he had only wanted to protect me from making financial mistakes. I listened without interrupting until he finally ran out of excuses. Then I quietly reached into the folder beside my chair and placed a certified appraisal on the table. Ethan stared at the number. It was more than $500,000 higher than the offer Lucas had presented only days earlier. Before he could recover, I placed a second folder beside it. This one contained the finalized trust documents Evelyn had completed earlier that week. "The house no longer belongs to me personally," I said calmly. "Neither do several of my largest assets." Ethan looked up so quickly that his chair nearly tipped backward. "What? Everything you believed you were negotiating has already been legally protected." I watched the realization spread across his face. Every conversation, every calculated visit, every carefully planned strategy, every lie told to Ben, every private discussion with Lucas. Months of manipulation had collapsed in less than 5 minutes. For the first time since all of this began, my son wasn't looking at me as an aging father he could influence. He was looking at the man who had quietly stayed 3 moves ahead of him the entire time. And then, with nothing left to hide, Ethan finally lowered his head and spoke the words I had been waiting to hear since the night he whispered, "Finally." "Dad, I need to tell you why I did it." For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Ethan remained frozen in his chair, staring at the trust documents, as though they had erased the future he had spent months planning. The confidence that had carried him into my house was gone. The polished real estate executive who always had the right answer had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a frightened son who had finally run out of lies. He slowly pushed the folders away and covered his face with both hands. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. "I'm drowning in debt, Dad." I didn't answer. Silence has a way of inviting the truth better than questions ever can. After a long breath, he continued. 3 years ago, I started investing in commercial developments. At first, everything worked. Every project made money. Banks kept increasing my credit lines. Investors kept calling. I honestly believed I'd figured out how to build wealth faster than anyone else. He laughed bitterly at himself. Then the market turned. Construction costs exploded. Interest rates climbed. 2 developments stalled. 1 investor pulled out at the last minute. I kept telling myself it was temporary. He lowered his eyes to the table. Instead of accepting the losses, I borrowed more money to keep the projects alive. Every loan depended on another project succeeding. Every delay pushed me deeper into debt. I had spent decades in business, and I had seen this pattern more times than I could count. Pride convinces intelligent people that one more deal will fix every mistake made before it. Sometimes it does. Most of the time, it destroys everything. Ethan swallowed hard before speaking again. I thought if I could just finish one successful redevelopment, everything would recover. I nodded slowly, but remained silent. Something still didn't fit. Debt could explain desperation. It could not explain betrayal. "That still doesn't explain the phone call," I said quietly. "Or the lies you told your brother." Ethan closed his eyes. He already knew there was no honest answer that could make me understand. "The first time Lucas mentioned your house, I told him, absolutely not," he admitted. "He said I was being emotional. He reminded me how much the land was worth. He kept telling me that you were getting older, that maintaining the property would become impossible sooner or later, and that someone else would eventually convince you to sell anyway." Ethan paused, ashamed of what came next. After hearing it enough times, it stopped sounding like stealing. The sentence hung in the room like smoke. He looked at me, but quickly lowered his eyes again. "I convinced myself I was helping you make the right financial decision. At least that's what I kept telling myself." I studied him for several seconds before asking the only question that mattered. "Did you actually believe that?" His shoulders slumped. "Not anymore." The honesty in that answer hurt more than another lie would have. "Then why continue?" I asked. Ethan's voice cracked. "Because by then, I wasn't trying to save my investments anymore. I was trying to hide how badly I had failed." He admitted that his debts had quietly exceeded several $1 million. Lucas knew everything. The developer had gradually transformed from a business partner into someone who controlled every decision Ethan made. Every failed project increased the pressure. Every new loan tightened the trap. Lucas eventually presented my house as the perfect solution. One profitable redevelopment would erase years of financial disaster. Ethan looked toward the family photograph hanging beside the fireplace. Margaret was smiling in the picture, standing between our two boys on the day we celebrated the company's 20th anniversary. "Mom would be ashamed of me," he whispered. I followed his eyes to the photograph. "Your mother would have forgiven failed investments," I replied calmly. "She would have stood beside you through bankruptcy if you had simply told the truth. What she never would have forgiven was using your own family as collateral." Ethan didn't argue. He couldn't. Everything I said was true. Then I asked about Ben. Ethan buried his face in his hands again. "I knew if Ben spoke to you directly, everything would fall apart. So I lied. I told him your investments had collapsed after Mom died. I said you were too proud to admit how bad things had become. I needed him to believe selling the house was the responsible thing to do." Hearing those words spoken aloud hurt more than overhearing the phone call outside my kitchen window. Ben hadn't been manipulated because he was naive. He had been manipulated because he trusted his older brother without question. The silence returned, heavier than before. Finally, Ethan looked at me with tears filling his eyes. "Is there anything I can do to fix this?" I looked down at the trust documents lying between us before answering. "Some things can be repaired with money. Some mistakes cannot." He waited, almost afraid to breathe. I met his eyes for the first time since he had confessed. "If this family has any chance of surviving, it won't begin with me forgiving you." I paused, just long enough for the words to settle. "It begins with you telling Ben the entire truth. Every lie, every conversation, every plan. If you want to save this family, you stop protecting yourself, and you start protecting the truth." Ethan slowly nodded. For the first time since walking into my house that afternoon, he wasn't thinking about debts, investments, or real estate. He was thinking about the brother whose trust he had destroyed, and the father he had nearly lost forever. Ethan left my house that afternoon looking like a man who had aged 10 years in a single conversation. For the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't carrying contracts, investment proposals, or carefully prepared explanations. He was carrying the weight of the truth. I didn't know whether he would actually do what I had asked, and honestly, I wasn't sure I cared anymore. There comes a point in every betrayal when the outcome no longer belongs to the person who was hurt. It belongs to the person who caused the damage. Ethan now had one decision left to make. 3 days later, he called and asked if he could come by. His voice sounded exhausted. There was no confidence left in it, only the quiet tone of someone who had spent several sleepless nights living with his own conscience. When he arrived, I noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes before he even stepped inside. He sat at the dining table without waiting to be invited, and placed his phone on the wood between us. "I told Ben everything," he said quietly. "Every lie, every conversation with Lucas, every plan, even the phone call you overheard." I studied him for a moment before asking the only question that mattered. "Did he believe you?" Ethan nodded slowly. "He believed me because I finally stopped trying to defend myself." He swallowed hard. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten me. He just kept asking one question over and over again. I leaned forward slightly. "What question?" Ethan lowered his eyes. He wanted to know why I trusted a businessman more than my own family. The room fell silent. That single question explained the entire tragedy better than months of arguments ever could. Ethan had never truly been defeated by debt. He had been defeated the moment he stopped believing that honesty inside his own family was worth more than the promises of a business partner. I opened the folder Evelyn had prepared and slowly placed the completed trust documents in front of him. "Everything is finished," I said. "The house, my investment accounts, the warehouse property, and every major asset Margaret and I built are now protected exactly the way we intended." Ethan looked at the papers, but made no attempt to touch them. "Does that mean I've lost everything?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "No." He looked up, surprised. "You've lost the ability to manipulate anything. Those are two very different things." He remained silent while I explained how the trust now worked. No single beneficiary would ever have the authority to pressure me into selling property. No emotional conversation could influence major financial decisions. Every significant action required independent legal oversight. Every safeguard Evelyn had promised was now permanently in place. Then I told him something he clearly wasn't expecting. "You're still one of the beneficiaries." Ethan stared at me. "I am?" "Yes." I held his gaze. "I never wanted to punish my son by erasing him from his mother's legacy. Margaret would never have wanted that either." He looked confused. "Then, why protect everything from me?" I answered without hesitation. "Because love and accountability are not opposites, they're partners. I protected the estate because I refused to let one person's fear destroy what generations of this family worked to build." I paused before continuing. "This trust doesn't exist because I stopped loving you. It exists because I refuse to let love become something that could be exploited." Ethan slowly nodded, and for the first time since this ordeal began, he wasn't asking how much anything was worth. He wasn't asking about market value, redevelopment potential, or investment returns. Instead, he asked the question only a son could ask. "Do you think Ben will ever forgive me?" I answered honestly. "I don't know." I let the silence settle before speaking again. Forgiveness isn't earned with one confession. It's earned through years of making different choices than the ones that brought you here. Ethan quietly closed the folder and stood. Before leaving, he stopped in front of the family photograph hanging above the fireplace. He stared at Margaret's smiling face for several seconds before whispering, "I spent so much time trying to secure what I thought would someday belong to me, that I nearly destroyed the people it already belonged with." After he walked out the front door, I remained standing in the hallway, looking at the same photograph. The legal battle was over. The trap Evelyn had designed had worked exactly as planned. My assets were safe, my home was protected, but as I stood in the silence Margaret had once filled with laughter, I realized the hardest part of this story had never been protecting my wealth. It was discovering whether a broken family could still find its way back to each other before it was too late. 6 months have passed since the afternoon. Ethan walked out of my house carrying the truth instead of another excuse. Life didn't suddenly become easy. Families don't heal because one difficult conversation ends. Trust doesn't return the moment someone admits they were wrong. It returns slowly, built through hundreds of ordinary choices made when nobody is watching. Those first few weeks were awkward for all of us. Ben still came by every Tuesday evening, just as he always had. Ethan stayed away for nearly a month, not because I asked him to, but because he understood that rebuilding trust begins with respecting the space you've broken. Eventually, he called and asked if he could join us for dinner. There were long silences that night. No one forced conversation. No one pretended everything was normal. We simply shared a meal. And for the first time in a long while, nobody lied. That was enough. Over the following months, Ethan sold the investment properties that had nearly destroyed his life. He accepted losses he had spent years trying to outrun. He ended every business relationship with Lucas Grant and cooperated fully when several investors began taking legal action against the developer for deceptive practices. Instead of searching for another shortcut, he found a steady position with a smaller commercial firm and started rebuilding his career, one honest decision at a time. The salary was lower. The title wasn't as impressive. But for the first time in years, he slept without wondering what lie he would have to tell the next morning. Ben never treated his brother like an enemy, but neither did he pretend nothing had happened. Their relationship became quieter, more careful, built one conversation at a time, instead of blind trust. Watching them slowly rebuild something that greed had almost destroyed reminded me of how Margaret used to repair broken furniture in our garage. She never tried to hide the cracks. She reinforced them until they became the strongest part of the piece. Perhaps families heal the same way. As for me, my mornings haven't changed very much. I still wake before sunrise. I still make a pot of coffee. I still sit beneath the maple tree Margaret planted all those years ago and watch the neighborhood come to life. The house never went on the market. It remains exactly where it has always been, not because it is the most valuable thing I own, but because it reminds me every single day what is truly worth protecting. People occasionally ask whether I regret testing my own son. My answer surprises them. I don't regret the test. I regret that I ever needed one. No father dreams of creating a trap to discover whether his own child can be trusted. But pretending not to see the truth would have cost far more than facing it. The trust Evelyn created will one day distribute everything Margaret and I spent our lives building. The house, the investments, the warehouse, and every other asset will eventually pass to the next generation exactly as we intended. But I hope my grandchildren inherit something far more valuable than property or money. I hope they inherit the lesson this family learned too late, that integrity is the only wealth that grows stronger when it is shared. Money can disappear overnight. Businesses can fail. Markets can collapse. Even beautiful homes can be sold. But once trust is traded for personal gain, rebuilding it may take the rest of your life. If my story leaves you with anything, let it be this. Protect your family before you protect your fortune. Because fortunes can always be earned again. A family's trust cannot. And if someone you love is still sitting across the dinner table tonight, tell them the truth while you still have the chance. One honest conversation today is worth more than a lifetime of regret tomorrow. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs the reminder that the greatest inheritance any parent can leave behind is not measured in dollars, but in the example of choosing honesty even when the truth breaks your heart.